I've been working on new 3D models for my game Bob Simulator, a sandbox game where you can build an adventure with utmost modability and creativity. Since I've been working on procedural generation recently, I need some models to populate the worlds. Today, I need various models for the game and the game's environments, starting with a clock tower. In 3D modeling, it makes sense, for buildings, to go with the simple cube as a start. Most buildings have square foundations, so it makes sense. Triangle tops are good, and you want a nice dynamically set up model so you can change the time in the clock. You wouldn't, for example, want the time on the clock to be a texture. It is better to rely on rotations of individual object pieces rather than texture changes, or other static properties if what you're after is dynamic design. Indenting and a proper mesh structure is also very important here, to make sure UV unwrapping isn't too inadequate. My game does not rely too heavily on high-fidelity graphics, so this isn't too much of a concern. But for example, I had to redo the textures of the bobs themselves, because the face part of their textures was being cut between different ends of the texture file, like different ends of the image. Now, with proper UV structure, it makes it far easier to modify and add new faces to the NPCs. It also helps with maintaining the modability of the game, which is incredibly important if you want the game's structure to itself be dynamic. This is one reason why I must also separate the clock tower into some amount of component parts. That way, they can be separated from each other in the Godot engine if a player wanted to, say, break a clock tower prop apart into pieces. Now, you might not want this behavior for all of your props, but building it into the model might allow for more freedom. This looks good. We need more than just a clock tower though, we need a barn. A good barn, not whatever this is. Let's see if we can spruce this up a bit. First of all, we should not be using a bunch of random cubes plopped together. What we should be doing is, well, one way to do it is to use a blender boolean to cut a hole in a convex shape, such as this one. Do this, and we have an interior. Then, you can adjust the opening using extrusions to create what looks like a door frame or an entrance to the newly made interior. We need to give this thing a roof as well, which normally I really do just use separate cubes for. But this time, we will build it directly into the model. I feel like Bob Ross right now. One other thing to keep note of is we will need some form of windows. That is, if we are basing it off the original design. I think a barn with windows may be more useful to the player's creativity than a barn without windows. It adds more possibilities, so I will allow for it. Windows, unfortunately, are a tricky thing to create if we made the interior using booleans. So I will start over from the beginning and... Just kidding. That won't be necessary. Now, I'm a minimalist when it comes to work. I'm lazy. So, I will try to separate the model into different parts based on what needs to be textured. That way, I don't need to make separate textures for all the sides like I did with the original design again. And there, it's just about done. We also need to texture some farmland or crops or something. Plants. Plants are interesting from a texture standpoint, or anything plant-related for that matter. We need to make them pop a little bit, but not being so jarring because these crops will show right next to each other in-game, and we don't want crops to be distracting. That would be bad. So instead, we'll go for a nice, smooth, blended feel to the textures, so they blend into the environment. You get the idea. Just for fun, I made some alternative kinds of crops of differing popping. Also, just so you know, I'm writing this script before I actually do any of this, so by saying that, I am giving myself more work. Oopsies. Now for dirt, using noising. Paint.net, which is the tool I use most often for texturing, has a built-in noise modifier, so I will just use that of differing density. The key to good noise depends on the application. For texturing especially, I add some noise, then I use the crystallize modifier. This gives me bigger noise, albeit at sharper angles. Might be perfectly fine for some applications, but for this it is not. To fix it, I then add a Gaussian blur effect to smooth out the hard edges and destroy the sharp angles. Finally, I add some more uniform noise over the whole thing. This gives me 2 layers of noise, more or less. Uniform noise over the image and larger, chunkier noise via the crystallize modifier. The last step, when making any kind of terrain texture, is to make the texture seamless. I usually do this by duplicating the dimensions of the image and using a clone brush to smush the ends of the image together, forcing it to tile through brute force. This is not the best way to do things, but it works enough for what I'm using it for. It should also be said that at large scales, any texture will feel like it's tiling under most circumstances. To circumvent this, you can add more larger-scale textures and noise to the material on the object the original texture was applied to in the Godot engine. For other engines, your method may differ, but the idea is to layer multiple textures on top of each other, some of which at larger scales, to ensure that even if you zoom out, you still see an overall texture. Next, and finally, we will need some trees and rocks to populate the terrain these buildings and crops and farmland will lie on. Trees are relatively easy. Start with a cube and do some extrusions over and over to create branches. Make sure to not move the branches around too much if what you're after is a naturalish feeling. For different applications, this may change. You can then add, for leaves, some planes or slim cubes. For this project, I will do this instead. Big bulbous pieces to plop onto the branches to give a feeling of leaves. I may add some extra alternative kinds of trees in the future, specifically for the sandbox mode, as some people may prefer different art styles. We can then model some rocks by starting with either cubes or decimated spheres and using sculpting mode to flop around with them a bit. For more fancy applications, you could bevel the ends and then subdivide the whole thing for a smoother look. Finally, let's make some nice dirt farmland rectangle things for the crops to lay in, as shown in the picture. Farmland terrain is easy to make. Take a plane and subdivide it, then warp it a bit. You could also use the sculpting tool to do it, but I would recommend using remesh or decimation afterwards for a more consistent mesh topology. And we're done. Now we have trees, and we have farmland, and we have crops to go into farmland as 2D texture models, and we have rocks and plants and all kinds of other goodies. We also have a clock tower and a barn. This is pretty good to start with. I may make more 3D models in the future as I develop the procedural generation system for Bob Simulator. I would like, in the future, for the generation itself to go up and down as well, not just left, right, forward, and backward. I am specifically developing the Bob's Omega Builder positional system to work this way, allowing the game to generate in all directions. This may unlock new possibilities. If you don't know what the Bob's Omega Builder is, you should watch my previous video where I explain all about how I've created a positional system that can store values with absolute precision all the way up to 10 to the 18 millionth power. Assuming I can get this system working, at least in single player, I will be able to create infinitely generating 3D worlds all the way out as far as your RAM can take you, which is much, much farther than any other 3D game I've ever seen. For all I know, this could be the first time someone's actually tried to do this for 3D generation. And if the first time this system is utilized in such a way is to bring Bob characters out into the ether, I'm not complaining because that's pretty funny. But anyway, thanks for watching. I plan to make more videos as I develop this project, so subscribe if you're interested in seeing the slow building up of Bob Simulator version 5? I think we're on 5. It's gotta be 5 by now. Anyway, thanks for watching me on my way to have Bobs out forever.